name is Matthew Lawrence. I'm the spiritual formation here at the Cathedral. It's my great delight to introduce to you Hunt Priest, who is an Episcopal priest serving out east in South Carolina?
Georgia, Savannah, Georgia.
Georgia, yeah. And he's here for a big conference, and I'm going to let him tell you all about it. And we're delighted to have him here to talk about this issue that is quite germane to Oregonians since the passage of this law. We're going to hear all about it. I give you Hunt Priest.
This opportunity. It's called the Horizons Conference. It's been about 15 years in New York, and this is the first time they brought it out of New York, and it's at the Portland Art Museum. So people, mostly from the West Coast, a lot of Oregonians, of course, they're hearing about, learning about how the laws are going to, how it's going to unfold in Oregon. So before I start, I want to tell you all that I was here in April. It was Palm Sunday in the church. I was here meeting. It was as the Oregon Health Authority was beginning to talk about, or beginning to make final decisions about the law. And I was here with a lawyer that was active in that and working and meeting people on the board, psilocybin advisory board, and came to church here. And I left my parish work about a year before to do what I'm doing now, which I'll tell you about. And I've been traveling a lot, so I was kind of irregular church attendance. I was just not, and before the pandemic, I've not been, since the pandemic, I've been in a full church. I came here at Palm Sunday. The room was full, music was beautiful, the sermon was great. All the places in the liturgy, we stood up for the creed, and I just teared up. I really cried, and I don't think it was about the words of the creed. I think it was just being back in a full church space with people, and there were young families and young people and older people. So whatever you all are doing here, it was beautiful. So thank you for that too, for your ministry. So one of the things we talk about in psychedelic presentations is a trip report or a talk about a journey is about like showing slides from a family vacation. You can do a little bit of it. Or talking about your dreams. So I want to tell you a little, just my story about how I got here. And then I've got a good friend here who's a Methodist minister in DC. I want him to make a little presentation because he's working at the intersection of psychology and spirituality. But so in the fall of 2015, I was the rector of the Episcopal Church on Mercer Island in Washington, between Seattle and Bellevue. And I've been there about, I guess about 6 years. And it was October, and I was at home, and I was flipping through Christian Century magazine and saw an ad for a study, a research study, at one of the big research institutions on the East Coast. And they were looking for religious professionals, clergy, chaplains, who had not done psychedelics, and they were doing a study about picking up on the research around depression and anxiety and trauma, addiction. And what they were hearing was people were having these profound religious experiences, and they wanted to check the language of the participants in these cancer and other studies against the world's religious traditions. They knew the answer, but they're scientists, and so they wanted to confirm that. So I was one of 26 in this 2-site study that will be released probably in January of the coming year. And so I saw the ad. I wrote them, and I thought, oh, I'll never get in because, golly, what a chance. And it took them 6 years to fill it up, but because they couldn't find rabbis who hadn't done psychedelics, and they couldn't find Christian clergy who were willing to. So I got in. The competition was low. I got in, and within a month, I was in Baltimore. On the sofa at a research institution there, and given a high dose of psilocybin in a capsule. And it was prescription from the pharmacy at the hospital there. They put it in a chalice. That's what they've done since the 50s, I think, in the research. And they bottoms up, and I had some water, and they put eye shades on me. And there's a playlist called the psilocybin playlist, and I put that earphones on, and for the next hour, I began to see colors and lights, sacred geometry, like you see in a mosque. So I was seeing these beautiful colors, and then spontaneously, I began to feel this energetic current in my spine, and it moved up my spine, came up, so uncomfortable, and it got right here, and the pressure was starting to build, and it was like an electrical current that couldn't get through a block. And so beyond uncomfortable, I began to think that my Adam's apple was going to explode. And so I had two guides. In that protocol, there's two guides. One had been ordained as a Methodist minister and a psychologist. That was a medical doctor. So one of the guys put his hands on my head, like I've done 1,000 times. He put his hands on my head, and the other medical doctor went to my feet and did what I did when my wife had our son. He had me pushed against him. So I had a doctor at my feet doing Lamaze, and I had a Methodist minister, a psychologist at my head, laid hands on me. And as soon as those hands went on my head, that electrical current went up 1,000%. And it blew what I would say now was the throat chakra. I didn't have that language, but it blew through that block, went out the top of my head. And then I began to shake, and shaking doesn't even describe it. I began to reach this ecstatic place, and I began to speak in tongues. Not often happens to Episcopal priests, and making sounds that I could not discern what they were. And I was aware. You're not with psilocybin. You're not incapacitated. I was aware. It's like a wake. So it's not like you're drunk or stoned or something. You really are. You have sort of control of your faculties. But I was at that point, and then I went in for the next 4 hours. I was in a state of deep ecstatic bliss, and then so that was the first experience. And there are other things that happened. And then a month later, I'm back in the same place with the same people. I made a joke about the 2 or 3 hour experience I had. It's a lot. That's probably not going to happen again. But I have to go to the restroom, came back, and it began to happen again. And at one point, I found myself on my stomach. It's a sofa turned into a bed. I had my head down, and I thought, oh, I'm praying like a Muslim. I'm praying sort of a form like Muslim, like a Muslim with my head on the ground. And then I remember my ordination to the priesthood in 2005. And I decided not to prostrate in front of the bishop and the altar. I decided to kneel, which we have that option. And I thought, oh God, this is like my ordination. And the thought that came into my consciousness was, my ordination is being completed at the feet of the universe. That was the awareness that I had. So that was in 2016. I went back to Seattle and realized my ministry was complete there. I didn't intend nothing. My son had 1 more year in school. It's completely off the radar for us to move. And then I saw a friend that sent a job in Savannah, not a place I ever thought I would live. We moved from Atlanta, but and so I moved to Savannah. And then about 4.5 years into that, I realized, as Oregon was beginning to talk about psilocybin, and I realized I had been given this incredible gift of a legal and safe experience of a Schedule I drug, and I knew this was coming somehow, and I realized there was no mechanism in my experience and the research that's going to come out about this group of people back to the church. And so I stayed in touch with the people, the researchers and the funders, and was able to leave my parish position to start a nonprofit called Ligare, which is Latin, to unite or to bind. It's the root word of ligament and religion. Religare is really to rebind to God. And so ligare.org was available. I thought, well, that's a sign from the gods. So that's the name of the organization. And it's a loose network of Christian leaders, lay and ordained, scholars, funders, interested people. And we're doing lots of stuff like this, mostly online. Maybe the first public thing like this I've done. I'm doing what? Oh, outside of that. The magic of technology. So had those 2 experiences, and I knew it was going to change my ministry. I knew I was going to somehow, as an Episcopal priest and as a person being given this gift, I just knew I wanted it for others. And so we're very interested in the mental health benefits. Those are documented. That's scientific research. MDMA, ecstasy, will be legal next year for trauma-assisted therapy. Psychedelic assisted therapy with MDMA. Psilocybin will be, we hope, legal as in the medical model within the next couple of years. And then in Oregon, it's going to be legal for any recreational, psychological, spiritual. And I think probably my main mission is to help the church see the potential for our ministry. Whether any of us ever do psychedelics, that's not, I hope we'll have discernment for that. Many people should, some shouldn't. There's some contraindications psychologically for that, and not everyone will be called to it, as not everyone should be. But I think my initial goal is to help the Christian community see that people are having these very religious and spiritual and mystical experiences. People are healing from those. The people that have the most significant mystical experience are having the most significant healing from trauma, depression, anxiety. I was in that study not for any of those things, but the next morning after that first experience, I realized that this anxiety that I've been carrying, that I'd gotten so used to, was gone. It was gone. And then, it comes back now. We live in 2022, it comes back. But it's at such a different level, and I can recognize it as a friend instead of this constant companion that was wearing me down. So I'm a testimony to the psychological benefit. It just went away. So mental health benefits, end of life for people that are given terminal diagnosis, profound results for people that are scared to die. 80% of people get relief from that anxiety with a little bit of psilocybin and therapy session. So there's going to be a role for chaplains and spiritual directors, for psychologists, and then for those of us in the church. I hope to form communities of support. So when your parishioners go to have an experience because they're dealing with depression or anxiety or addiction, they can come back to their faith community and have a circle of support to continue to heal. If the church is not invested in healing, I'm not sure why we're I think of this as the healing ministry of Jesus, the healing ministry of the church, and one more place where we can be of service. With chaplaincy, spiritual direction, clergy who are informed. I think these are retreats. So Ligare hosted a retreat in the Netherlands with psilocybin legal there. 13 American and Canadian clergy, 5-day retreat with morning prayer, evening prayer, Eucharist, healing liturgy, laying on of hands, camping, singing, shared meals, walks in the woods. And on the third day, a pretty significant dose of psilocybin for all the participants, and 6 guides around the room to be there. And all of them, without exception, had a very profound experience, a deepening of their own ministry, appreciation for the religious tradition they come from. So, so the potential is huge. I do want to leave time. I'm going to for questions. I want us to have a conversation about this. I'm going to ask my friend Jim to come up and talk about his work. He's a Methodist minister. He lives in Washington, D.C. He's also a psychotherapist working with young men mostly in the Washington, D.C. area, and is in training right now to be a psychedelic trained therapist. So Jim, why don't you come up and introduce yourself and say a little bit more about where you see this.
How's everybody? It's been a strange road to this place to be able to talk about something that has been demonized in the culture, and for a lot of good reasons of what happened in the 60s. Those of you around then and saw the movement and the Timothy Leary and all of that. So we are in recovery from that, and this what they call the psychedelic renaissance is. I don't use that word very often because it's not at all a renaissance. These medicines have been used with indigenous populations for thousands of years, longer than before Jesus came. This is such an important time to begin to integrate, possibly integrating something that is grows on the earth, that our foods can heal us, our things we ingest can heal us and can kill us. And so I came about it. I'm in the California Institute of Integral Studies. It's the Psychedelic Assisted Therapies program. So it is training people. There are about 900 that are trained thus far in 2 tracks. It's a clinical track, and it's just all forms of medical folks and people in the healthcare industry. And then they have a clergy track. The clergy track is very, very small. And for reasons that Hunt just, there's not many, there's not a lot of and the pastors that are in there lot of Unitarians and they're so people have this openness. So there are very few traditional clergy from mainline churches. But the fascinating part about this for mental health, and if approaching this conversation from a mental health lens, and that's what I'm trained to do. I'm trained as a clergy, but my passion is with the healing that can happen through this model, this medicine. So any Google search that you do will take you to research papers. There's an article, it seems every week in the New York Times or Washington Post about the research and what's going on. And so now it's just being brought into the mainstream, and people who are talking about it are people of substance and people that are respected. So it'll be harder to marginalize it. As in we find people with testimonials about how it has completely changed the way in which they see themselves, and they hold it's as beautiful efficacy for trauma, for working through trauma, having people just alleviation from all forms of mental illness. Now, it's not a magic bullet or a magic thing. It's again not for everybody, but the research that's coming back is so compelling to think about. Someone be able to have an experience, but not just an experience like you would with an individual. I had my drug experience, and then I went and I worked on myself, and that it's a capacity to be a communal thing, that there's a process of bringing someone in, having an experience, and then having what's called integration. So integration would be any form of formation. If you came into a church and you wanted to belong to the church, and you would learn about the church's customs and learn about it. And so you'd be through this Christian formation. So the same type of formation can happen spiritually and psychologically. So I think to start the conversation with it is saving people's lives. And the reason that MDMA, which is the street form of ecstasy, that it'll be legalized in the next year is because the training that's shown for soldiers returning from combat and severe PTSD, and they're finding this is saving soldiers' lives, veterans' lives. That's compelling to the U.S. government, and so it is really being hastened because of that. And the clinical trials that are happening are more and more people are. It's just my father. I'm from Western North Carolina, and my dad's 84. And to explain to my dad what I'm doing, he's never really understood what it is. I'm brought up in the United Methodist container, but I've taken a very different route. But to talk to him about the healing properties of these medicines that are ancient, and he just said it's compelling, it's hard to look away from it. So we need to, with sober judgment and open hearts, to look and see what can happen with these medicines. So I'll just close by saying, am I missing anything? Close by saying, the reason that I began my journey, I just met with my Bishop of Western North Carolina Annual Conference, Ken Carter, 2 weeks ago. And I'm in this movement of DC called Church of the Savior, and it has Methodist roots, but not specifically United Methodist. And so I was talking to him about my work there for the last 20 years. And then I have a copy of Bill Richards' book, Sacred Knowledge, of the intersection of spirituality and psychedelics. Bill's a United Methodist minister, he's a researcher, and he's one of the grandfathers of psychedelic research since the 60s. And so I gave him a copy of this, and then I said, I'm in this training, and I started to talk about, he was not naive about the conversation of psychedelics, but I was able to say, and this is a risk, unlike Hunt, I had a psilocybin experience in an underground community. It was led by a rabbi, a shaman woman, and this beautifully safe container that I was brought to by a therapist, a Reiki master and an acupuncturist and a healer. And what I was healing from childhood, my own childhood trauma, that I thought as a talk therapist, and I've spent thousands of dollars in my own talk therapy, and something wasn't coming through. So similar to Hunt's block, mine was in the heart. And so I had this experience that I have a tough time explaining. but it enabled for that same type of movement, that same type of current to come through. Then I began in a community, in a group of people who I did not know beforehand, began talking about what it is that has been holding me back. So it becomes this beautiful container that's where people are sharing their pain in safe places, where people are respected and the boundaries are very clear, and then people are finding healing. We shouldn't be surprised at that as church people. This is the place. If the church isn't at the forefront of this work, then the church is already, American Christianity is already, it seems like the United Methodist Church is splitting, as some of you know, and just the wrong side of history so often are the impediments to this movement because of people's fear and fear of experience. And the reason that our theologies are around us was initially to contain an experience, to define the experience. So often we get in situations in churches where people are attached to ideology, theology, and dogma, and doctrine. And that's not wrong, but it becomes dangerous when that's all that you have. And that's what we see with the rise of evangelicalism and this movement of Christian nationalism. It's incredibly dangerous. This is coming at a time that we need it the most. So as best you can, continue to ask these questions, to work with it as a community, because we have the opportunity as Christians to be on the forefront of this, of being behind this healing modality. Thanks for letting me share. Thank you.
And I'm trying to get in the habit of this. I haven't done too many public talks, so I do think as Christians we need to acknowledge the harm that the church did over time, over the history of colonialism and conquest. These substances were being used in the Americas long before we got here, and it was both sacramental, it was religious, and healing, physical healing. They were used for healing. Still are Native American church and community. So, and the church separated the indigenous people from their healing sacraments and of course conversion. So the church did a lot of damage on lots of fronts, but particularly in this front. So there's, I think a lot of the indigenous communities are a little suspicious of any Christian conversation about this. So I think all of us need to be aware that we didn't invent. We always, people look like us always want to think we invented everything and discovered everything. And these were healing people. In the 50s, some Americans discovered Maria Sabina in Mexico, in Oaxaca, and she was working with mushrooms down there. And all of a sudden, it was a place that all the hippies were going. So we need some caution and some restraint, and we probably never in the last 1,000 years needed as much healing as we need now. Planet and some people, the culture. But I'm hoping it's right on schedule. So to acknowledge that, and then to just say that, again, this isn't for everyone, but it's all of us need to be aware of it. And I think I'm interested in how the church can help us discern. Am I called to join a circle of people that are, am I called to a retreat to go 5 days and then have this experience with a group of people and then come back and be changed, because it does change you. Changes you. It heals you. It changes you. And it's not without risk. When I went to the first session, one of the guides said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "I'm nervous." He said, "You should be. You're about to meet God." That's really sort of, you should be, because this is not, it's significant. And it's not to be played with. It's not to be played with. It's powerful. It's powerful stuff. So I'm gonna I want this to be a discussion. So feel free to ask me questions of Jim or share your own information.
I'd love to hear your thoughts about the fear that you talked about. Why is it that Christianity has demonized this practice? What do you think is behind that?
Well, I think it's multifaceted. I think historically, church came in places like Mexico, the U.S., to conquer. And so if you've got a group that's already encountering God with plants and their community, and then it's, instead of maybe a better idea would have been to integrate that into Christian practice, but that's not really how the church functions very often. And so I think that it was control. It's control. And then I think in the 70s, the war on drugs, there's documented evidence that the Nixon administration in the early 70s decided to schedule marijuana and other drugs to completely eliminate the threat of, to eliminate the Black voice and the hippie, the left, because evening after evening, after all those drugs were scheduled, Schedule 1, every night there'd be reports of busts, and it's Black people and the left. And I think it was Haldeman or Ehrlichman admitted that that's what it was. That the war on drugs was a political move to eliminate the competition. So, yes.
When there was a question in the chat on there that was very, somebody might pull that up.
Okay.
And my other thing is, my one concern is about the recreational.
Mhm.
Like you said, it's not going to be played.
Right.
And that's kind of why, when it was on the ballot, I could see the medical uses, but I couldn't, the idea of the recreational concerned me, and I
Yeah.
voted again, because I don't think it should be
Yeah.
for just anyone.
Yeah.
I also think that burning marijuana is a stinky thing that shouldn't be happening.
Yeah.
Where we put your brownies, but keep it out my lungs.
Oh, no, yeah. I get, I mean, I do, I think one of the things we can do is to, it's gonna happen, it's happening recreationally anyway. So, and I don't even, in some ways, I don't think it's not bad to have fun, so, but the container, it's hard to keep people safe. And I think we want to keep people safe. We want set and setting. What's your mindset about this, and then what's the safe container that you're in? What's the setting? And I think the more and more creative we can be about offering low-cost settings with qualified people to support, and I think that's, and I think it wasn't going to pass without the recreational option. I don't think. So, yes.
I want to talk to the model again. You said on day 3, then after people are there and get pointed, then they get a significant dose. So are you just, is it a single dose event, or are you doing medical type of dosing at small percentages and building people up to a level of acceptability?
I mean,
And do you have medical oversight with you?
yeah, thank you. We had medical approval for what we were doing, and we had 6 trained guides who've been trained as Jim had been in that setting. And with psilocybin, we screen people, psychologically screened them, spiritually screened them. Some people had experiences, but we used protocols for screening that had a medical sort of orientation to them. We were in Holland, where this is legal, at a retreat center to keep people safe, and with trained guides, and we had a medical EMT on call. So we did keeping people safe, even though there's really not a whole lot of documented evidence of people having an extreme medical adverse reaction. People can have a psychological adverse reaction, which are rare, but no medical with the mushroom. There's truffles, psilocybin truffles. So, and I think to give people the experience, and they can decide on their own whether or not this is something to continue with. Houston Smith, the great theologian and historian of Christianity, said one time, everything I need to know. So,
Houston Smith preached here.
oh,
It was one and only time that he preached. He's
Yeah.
a Methodist minister.
yeah, right. So, and was in the Good Friday experiment, which I mentioned, 1962 at Boston University in the Marsh Chapel. Howard Thurman preaching for 3 hours and music in the upstairs. 25 Boston area seminarians downstairs, half given psilocybin, half given the placebo, and then all of that knowledge, and Houston Smith was one of them. All of that knowledge and all the scientific research, all the spiritual experiences, 1972,
Right.
disappeared as if it never happened. Literally disappeared as if it never happened. It became, if you're an academic asking about psychedelics, it would be the end of your career. That's how the culture can just swap.
I think Leary was chastised before that, though. I can remember being
Oh, yeah.
on the cover
In the
of
early
Time
60s,
magazine,
yeah.
1963,
Right.
Tony Turn On, Drop Out.
Right.
And I think there was this pervasive fear, even before the political
Yeah,
element
right.
came into it,
Yeah.
of, whatever crazy stuff could happen. there.
Right.
And it would be compromising to you.
And reckless use. I mean, I think
Reckless
to your
use,
point, it's reckless use.
Yeah.
It was framed as only recreational at that time.
Oh, yeah. So to the question, was psilocybin used by indigenous culture? Yes, Maria Sabina was in Oaxaca, Mazatec. It's a Mazatec community. Again, we just don't have it's not been documented, but it's certainly documented there. An article in Life magazine in the late 50s about this guy named Gordon Wasson who went down there to meet with Maria Sabina and had discovered her and encountered her. And then that was one of the little flowerings of this. And then her community, because so many North Americans came down there overrunning the place, she ended up being completely excluded from her community. So Maria Sabina, took a very personal call.
And there's another.
Oh. Has it been shown that a controlled environment is different than a more Catholic natural setting? I think again, some people are going to need many people are going to need a clinical setting with a therapist. This is not for trauma, severe depression, anxiety. We need professional clinicians, and we need a lot of them because we have a lot of mental health issues. I think for a lot of us that are trying to not have a mental health crisis, I think this can be done in nature but again, people you trust because they're very vulnerable. Again, it's like awakening, but you're vulnerable because so much gets stirred up. So I think we've all got to discern. We've got to discern the environments when we do this. And in Oregon, you're going to have a lot of options. And I want there to be a church option.
Let's see. So Bill Richards, who was doing this work in the 60s and in the early 60s, and Timothy Leary reached out to him and they met. And so I asked Bill, what was it about Leary and all that? And he said, you'll appreciate this. He said, they were in need. Leary was in need of a stern abbot. That the community that he had was that 60s, that bacchanalian expression. And Bill said it lost its container. So there wasn't anything to hold it. So that's why doing this work is that we have to come to it with all kinds of safety and integrity, and to be able to be practicing what we're preaching, to be very careful because the medicines these are powerful. It's nothing to be played with. And in community, it's nothing to be played with. And how we treat one another and how we support one another. So that's a huge thing that is the little bit of the fear that I have around the recreational part. You got somebody in their early 20s that just wants to use this and go hiking in the woods. And that's where it's like, it can be, it needs to have some form of containment and community with it.
Well, I might beg to differ, I guess. Having been one of those guys walking through the woods with my friends and who felt perfectly able to make a decision about what my own safe context was and so on. Certainly there's excesses in the 60s or whatever, but a lot of people have been doing this safely and coming to the very same realizations and passing it on informally.
Right.
And you do it in your living room with your friends and listen to Tangerine Dream and
Yeah, I wouldn't want to peg that out and say that can't happen. Just I work with young men and I see this a lot. I work with the people who have had difficult times with it. So I'm cautious on the other side, but I hear you.
No, it's like how to find the balance. And of course, it's having every option available and then a thorough education about those options so people's natural wisdom can guide them.
Oregon is going to be a big experiment. The data that we'll get out after the first couple of years of this will be, because all the research has been small samples, it's very expensive to do that research. So like it or not, they're going to be allowed. So yeah. Jim, question?
I did. What would you say is the impetus for turning this psychedelic from the forbidden of the hippies to the acceptability now? What changed that?
I think solid. Well, I think remembering that we've done research in the 40s, 50s, and 60s already, and then the institutions that picked that up because we've always known that LSD, psilocybin, mescaline can heal serious mental illness, and the tools we have now aren't really much better than placebo. So I think and good science. I think with good science is what we didn't have before. We had it, but we didn't have. We always had to fix a problem. We can't just do things because it's going to help us be a better human being. It's got to fix the problem. We got a lot of problems to fix. And so I think that thank goodness for the 20 years of research. And that's going to be ongoing. It's happening in California, it's happening on this coast. I think at least 20 research institutions in the country are doing work on this. Oh. No retreat plan currently. Yeah, so I think there'll be people that'll be doing this outside, inside, all around the house. So I don't think any one way is better. I think it's back to where do you connect with God? That'd be my question. And I think that's why, at least in the Christian context, I think retreats, but this is not a Sunday morning activity. I think retreats where people go away and develop community, which you do so quickly on a retreat. A 4 or 5 day retreat with fellow Christians who have the same language, ritual, appreciation of ritual. Christian container, I believe, is so ready, will be such a resource for so many people. Christian spiritual practice and community, which is what we're about. So no retreat presently planned, but same place to receive a psychotropic for spiritual purposes. I think once 2023 is when this will be legal in Oregon, and the processes are being written as we go. And then I think by the time the year starts, there'll be a lot more clarity about that. It'll be widely available. But I think I'll be working hard to figure out how we can offer this in a Christian setting. I think we have these retreat centers that are underutilized. I mean, that's down the road, but I really can see the communities that want to embrace this real ministry opportunity. We have property, we have people that are willing to volunteer their time or to do it. It'll reduce cost, and we can be part of making this more available to people that couldn't necessarily afford it, access. The church can do that.
You said it will become legal in 2023.
In Oregon.
In Oregon, legally for medicinal purposes or for recreation?
Anybody. Yeah, it'll be a service center. You have to go to a service center to get it.
Not retail like cannabis.
Not like cannabis.
No.
Yeah, there'll be service centers in the counties and cities that allow it, that have it. So obviously important, there'll be service centers. It won't be inexpensive, but it'll be available. It won't be covered by insurance because it's federal law. It's following the cannabis track, really. And the hope is we'll do it better. Cannabis go out issues.
You mentioned that for some people it's contraindicated. Can you talk about for whom it might
And
be?
again, we plan to have enough research about this, but schizophrenia, for sure. Bipolar disorder, bipolar 1. And yet again, we don't really know, but that's the research that's screened out of every clinical trial because there's just not a lot of. And in the 60s, I think one of the things that LSD, I remember this in my own community that I grew up in. There was a guy that was 5 years older than I was, and everybody knew he did a lot of LSD. He was also schizophrenic. And the way the story was told was he became schizophrenic because he was schizophrenic because of LSD, which now we know is not the case. He was the right age, and he was self-medicating. And so LSD was so demonized, and it was very effective. Lots of people using LSD therapy in the 50s. So very widely. So, yes.
So I've heard you talk a lot about psilocybin. What about other sort of traditional indigenous substances like peyote or ayahuasca or things like? Is research being done into
Yes,
those?
but yeah.
And the traditions around those, like how are those sort of being incorporated into this research?
Well, I think just talk about Oregon. Psilocybin is it's the shortest experience, like 5 or 6 hours. I mean, LSD is all day. So mushrooms don't have the baggage that LSD has, and peyote is problematic not because of how it affects people, but because it's so rare and scarce and needs to be reserved for the indigenous community. So, but San Pedro, there's lots of other cacti. San Pedro grows quickly, it grows anywhere, that's very accessible. I think Oregon's just being careful and saying this, we know there's very little risk with psilocybin, even you can't overdose on it. It grows everywhere, and it just doesn't have the baggage. And so I think it was smart to focus on one compound, one strain. It's only going to be one strain, and it's an experiment. So we'll see in 2 years. There may be San Pedro clinics, and there may be. Ayahuasca is from the jungle in South America. That's a much bigger experience too. Very physically difficult, but peyote doesn't have a lot of side effects. Very little nausea. The experience is pretty accessible, clean. It's just mushroom. So I think, but it's all there's lots of them out there, And I think research is focused on psilocybin mostly, and now LSD.
I was involved in the latter 60s with some research on LSD during my psychiatric residency. And some people had remarkable development of insight, and other people just couldn't handle the insights they received, and it had a very negative effect on them. And then the decision was made not to continue the research because of the problems involved.
Right.
And it has to do with how well a person is psychologically integrated, and if they can handle having their defensive barriers broken down, because they're there for a reason, and you take them away, you don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, so
I think what you're doing and advocating is very interesting.
yeah, and
Hope to live long enough to see how it works.
Yeah, well, you live in Portland, got about 6 months and you. So, yeah, and there's side effects and risk with every, and I think psilocybin has a lower risk profile. That's another. LSD has a little higher risk profile because it is so strong, and it does, and yet it can be profound. So, and those screenings they're there, but we're gonna learn a lot. And you gotta have a little bit of risk tolerance.
Right.
Yeah, yes. Ma'am.
The last question.
Oh, hey, yeah. How can you find a therapist or spiritual leader to embark on this journey? You have to watch. You will be very tired of hearing about this pretty soon. I think it's going to be in Oregon. You're going to. It's already out there, and now that you've been to this, you're going to really. If you haven't been seeing the coverage, you're going to see it. And I think that's one of the things that I'm working on is to get resources for spiritual directors, chaplains, and clergy to be so informed that they'll be able to, if you come here to the cathedral, that the staff will be able to say, here's a place that's doing this, we trust them, they're doing it in a very spiritual way, they're well trained, they're safe, and then have that experience and come back to the cathedral and talk about it. Yeah.
So what is the church, the American Church, say? What,
Well,
you know, we had the presiding bishop.
I know. Yeah. I'm a little intimidated.
Nobody asked him.
So again, we're at this kind of weird place where people know about it, lots of bishops know about it. And I think people are just waiting to find the right, like I did, I waited for the right time to come out. And it was 5 years. When I first was in that study, I talked about it, and I got kind of, the reaction I got just said, okay, it's not time. Michael Pollan's book, the documentary that was just released on Netflix, How to Change Your Mind, I think it's changed the whole conversation. And it's made it a much easier conversation. In the Episcopal Church, there are bishops, cathedral deans, academics are very interested and are just waiting, I think, for a little critical mass. So that's what I'm doing. And my hope is that once the study that I was in comes out, we can all pop up and say, I've done it. Yeah. Many people felt calls to ministry after psychedelic experience. Yes.
Yeah, so there are things that you were talking about contraindications like bipolar 1 and schizophrenia. There's also things like, what about like people who are on medication, prescribed medication? Because there are some things like, there's certain medications that if you eat, some of the food comes around Halloween time has charcoal in it to make it look black, to get that spooky look.
Yeah.
But that activated charcoal in that, it's that hamburger bun
Yeah.
black can also cause interactions with medications that people are taking to a not great, overall, it makes it ineffective or other things.
A huge part of the screening in any the service centers in Oregon there'll be a pretty extensive screen of medication, diagnosis, and so there'll be in the studies, you have to come off any other like depression medication. So again, and we don't quite, it's about interaction and we just don't have enough data. So you can't really be on SSRIs and being.
No, what about like non-SSRI? Other,
Yeah, I don't know, but I know that any responsible provider will have to do an in-depth screening of all of our psychological medical history.
yeah, I work as a pharmacy tech
Okay.
in mail order pharmacy and retail, central retail for Bill one, and some of our biggest moving drugs are for diabetes and high blood pressure and things like that. A lot of people are on.
Right, yeah.
And
It's really more
if anyone looked at-
psychological medication. Yeah.
if anyone looked at, how does this affect,
Yeah, these research institutions have done that. Blood pressure is another thing that needs to be regulated before we do it, because it can raise your blood. Any other? I just would encourage, I encourage all of you to, because it's really, Oregon's going to be important in this whole movement. And even if it's like, you think, that's not anything I would ever do, to be comfortable with the extreme healing potential for traumatized people, for depressed people, for people with addictions. It's the results of the research is pretty unrefutable. People are being dramatically cured of the problem.
One other question, which is it anticipated that there will be a reduction in the use of like anti-anxiety medication, antidepressant, that sort of thing as a result of this?
Yeah, I think, because 2 or 3 sessions can relieve people of extreme mental health. And it lasts. It's not like a pill or an antibiotic. You take it and it goes away. It's like it changes your brain. It changes our brain. That's really what happens. It changes our brain. Neuroplasticity, neural pathways.
There's also a danger to be aware of is that when it's in this medical model, you have, it'll be to receive services for this will start out and be expensive. And so the question that's being asked in the settings where the research settings are people of color, the indigenous populations are coming forth and saying, we don't want to be excluded from the conversation, which does happen. That folks that have the power are able to do this. And so this needs to be something at some point pretty soon when it's legal, is that it's almost free. It's able to access it. If someone is looking for healing, that it can happen, but it'll start out being something that is only accessible to those with discretionary income. And that's a worry. And so the voices, I think it's very important when you're hearing the conversation around it, see who it is that's saying and where the voices of color are that are bringing people back to the point of it. Those that are in most need of healing are those that are marginalized in our culture, and those are Black and brown bodies, and those are female bodies, and so I don't think we can talk about it enough.
Thank you all, and thank you for,